You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Kezia Dugdale, the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, and Matthew Lesh, the head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Eye leads with news of fresh and more disruptive mass NHS strikes in January. As it says, the health unions are digging in for a battle with Downing Street over pay demands. The Times carries a plea from health officials for people with coughs or colds to stay away from grandparents as flu cases rise and add further to the pressure on the NHS. Despite the current economic misery, the Express says that we will have a Merry Christmas because people are determined to splash what's left of their cash over the next 2 days. The change of law in Scotland on gender identification makes the lead for The Guardian, which says Number 10 is set to challenge it, raising the spectre of a major constitutional row. Well, that story is also the lead on the front of tomorrow's Daily Mail. The Telegraph goes with an investigation into the case of a multiple child murderer who it says was freed to kill after what it calls appalling blunders by the probation service. The Mirror claims an exclusive with news that security surrounding the King is to be reviewed amid fears for his safety after a series of incidents where eggs were thrown. The Financial Times leads with growing criticism of America's green subsidies package, which many in the EU and now Britain's International Trade Secretary say is too protectionist and will hit UK-based makers of electric vehicles and the like. While The Sun has a story about romantic goings-on backstage at Strictly Come Dancing. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Kezia Dugdale and Matthew Lesh. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us this evening. Let's start with the Eye front page and this NHS mass strikes in January, further strikes that the public will have to deal with, Kezia.
Yeah, so the front page here leading on the fact that we now expect there to be 2 strikes in January by ambulance staff. We're also expecting new dates from nurses to strike early in the new year. And there's a suggestion here in the Eye that junior doctors might join them on the picket line as well. And the sum total of those 3 actions could lead us to the most significant strikes in the NHS's entire history. Why? Because they want, rightly in my view, a better pay deal, or at the very least for the UK government to get round to the table and to talk about pay, which so far has eluded them.
Yes, and Matthew, it does seem that talks have been not forthcoming with the government, though that they have been asking for them. They're saying they're leaving it to the independent pay review. But is that a poor excuse? Should they be able to talk with the very politicians who make the ultimate decisions?
Look, I think the government's stuck in a very difficult position here. The underlying factors that we have skyrocketing inflation and low growth, which means everyone pretty much across the public and private sectors are experiencing a real terms decline in their income. Now, public sector workers did do disproportionately well during the pandemic with respect to job security. And some of the demands we're now hearing, I think, are out of whack to what is viable. For example, the nurses making a claim for RPI inflation plus 5%. That's like a 19% pay rise. Now, the government says that this would cost each household something like 500 to 1,000 quid extra. I think they're worried if they start opening up the pay negotiations with one particularly righteous part of the NHS, then the risk is that this will get carried over to every other negotiation the government's doing in the public sector, and therefore this all gets out of hand and not particularly affordable in the short run. And I think what we've just seen in Scotland, which is the Scottish nurses rejecting an increased pay deal from the Scottish government of 7.5%, shows that these negotiations are fraught with difficulty.
We read that the Tory veteran, according to the Eye, Ken Clarke, who served as Health Secretary and Chancellor, he says that ministers should weather the storm and we can't return to the situation of 40 years ago. Is that what you believe ministers are doing, weathering the storm and really bracing themselves for growing unpopularity, as we read? Kezia?
No, I think the UK government need to realise that this is a very serious situation, that they do have to get around the table and start to negotiate around the issue of pay, because people do not want to strike. Bear in mind, every time an NHS worker goes on strike, they lose their pay. They have to rely on strike pay. This is absolutely the last resort. I think it's a very difficult argument to make that the one thing nurses had during the pandemic was job security, because so many people were ill. We owe these NHS workers a huge debt of gratitude. They are on low pay. They've had public sector pay freeze for the best part of a decade now. Inflation is rising and they deserve a pay rise. Now, of course, any pay negotiations is exactly that. It's a negotiation. The nurses go in with a starting point and their starting point is very high. They want inflation plus 5%. And the UK government have to go in with their starting point, and they point to the independent pay review body, the kind of arbiter of these deals in the past. The consent around that process is broken. That's what's led to these strikes. The unions want to negotiate. It's going to require the UK government to come to the table and at least talk about pay to improve on the offer. And Matthew's right to say that the Scottish government put a deal on the table and that's now been rejected. But the very fact they were negotiating on pay means that there was no strike in Scotland last week, because they were prepared to enter those negotiations. The dispute is by no means over. I'm not suggesting that for a second. But talking, getting around the table, is one way to avert the type of strike action we're going to see, which is going to bring the NHS close to a halt at the turn of the year.
Matthew, many commentators are now saying that the government are probably holding out for the independent pay review body's new session in the new year, and that's when real negotiation will start. Do you think that's the likely outcome?
Look, I think that's a very potential outcome. There's been some discussion about the government bringing forward the next pay round. So rather than people getting a kind of backdated pay mid-year, people will start getting the higher pay from the next round in the second quarter of the year. The government's also obviously looking at laws, particularly on the railways, for minimum service requirements, changing some of the requirements about the level of support you need to call a strike action. I think none of that's particularly ideal response. I think people do have a right to strike and make a claim about their pay, and that should only be restricted in very limited circumstances. But at the same time, again, here we've got to ask ourselves a few things. One, the NHS is receiving record funding. There's a record number of staff in the NHS as well, particularly consultants and doctors and nurses, and yet the outcomes we're seeing aren't getting better. So what does the government do with respect to reforming the NHS? And then secondarily to that, where are we going to pay for these additional claims on the public purse? Are we talking about higher taxes? Are we talking about more debt and higher interest rates? What is the choice that people who do want to see these pay rises across the public sector, what choice are they going to make? Where is the money going to come from?
Let's move on to The Guardian. And Number 10 is threatening to block a law that would make Scotland the first part of the UK to introduce self-identification for those who want to legally change gender. Kezia, take us into this story.
So let's start with the bill first. So this is a huge moment today in the Scottish Parliament, passing the Gender Recognition Reform Act. It was passed by a majority of 2-1, with support from all 5 of Scotland's main political parties. It's been an issue which has been in Scottish political debate since 2016. It's been around so long. I was Labour leader when it was committed to back in those years, so many years ago. So the legislation passed today, and now people no longer need to go through a medical process in order to change gender. There's no doubt it's been a very heated and difficult debate in Scotland at times. Most of the Conservative benches in the Scottish Parliament were against it. And that has now led to the UK government suggesting that they might challenge it under the Scotland Act. Now, the section they're relying on, section 35, would allow them to challenge the bill if they think it might adversely affect on an area of law which is reserved to the UK Parliament. And I think what they mean by that is the Equality Act. They're concerned that there might be something in this bill which goes against what the Equality Act intends to do. Now, the Scottish Government are saying very firmly and very clearly that's not the case. In fact, they rejected several amendments put forward by the Scottish Conservative Party in the Chamber to put the Equality Act on the face of the bill in such a way that it would do exactly what they're now being accused of doing. So the Scottish Government are firm in their view that everything they've passed today was within the competency of the Scottish Parliament, and they believe the UK Government want to challenge this law because they just don't like it.
Yeah, Westminster have made clear that it would consider a nuclear option of blocking the bill going for royal assent, a move, as we've discussed, that would enrage both supporters of the reforms and nationalists. Matthew.
I think that's absolutely right. This, in some respects, risks giving a bit of a free kick to the SNP and to the Nationalists by demonstrating the way in which Westminster is overriding the democratic will of the Scottish people. I think a key part of decentralising power is the fact that you have to accept that sometimes subnational government's going to use the powers in ways you don't necessarily like, and you should be very wary about interfering with the use of those powers. Ultimately, this will end up in most likely in a court case. It'll be up to judges to decide, which is not a particularly great outcome either, whether or not there's a contradiction between this bill and the Gender Equalities Act. Now, I think there's a few respects in which the SNP have decided to take a very forthright position on gender recognition, something that I'm personally quite sympathetic to, but at the same time raises some issues related to sex offenders able to take advantage of it, to exploit it. To what extent are there free speech and people able to disagree with this law within Scotland, particularly under the new hate speech laws that Scotland's passed? So there's a few associated issues here that probably do raise serious policy questions and need to be addressed. But as has been said, using Section 35 would be quite a jackhammer approach to this. It would be quite an extreme response.
Kezia, do you agree with all areas of the potential law?
I do support it. I've always supported it, and I do so as a feminist and a member of the LGBT community. I've never found any contradiction between my feminism and my LGBT rights activism. That said, I do understand why some people are concerned about it. They worry about the intrusion into women's spaces. But what I have been very confident in, having looked at the detail of the law, is that everything the Equality Act says about having sex-based protected spaces is as true today and tomorrow as it was yesterday, and indeed when the Equality Act was passed 10 years ago. Now, it is the case that you can have trans women in women's prisons. That's been the case since 2004. What this process does is make it easier for some people to access gender recognition certificates. And that has led to people who are against this bill being concerned about there being vast numbers of people falsely seeking to change gender in order to access women's spaces. Now, there are very legitimate concerns there, but they're not concerns that have persuaded me to be against the overall purpose of this bill. I think there are many safeguards and protections in place to avoid the circumstances that those campaigners are most concerned about.
Matthew Lesh, what do you make of the provision for Scots to apply for a birth certificate with their new sex within 6 months, and that's without a gender dysphoria diagnosis, so with no diagnosis at all?
Look, ultimately, in my mind, I see this in some respects as giving people a greater freedom to decide how they want to be recognised and how they identify with respect to government services. And I have no issue with requirements associated with, as you've said, applying for a new birth certificate. Now, of course, there's associated issues here that are necessary and need to be discussed in terms of access to single-sex spaces. But I think it's worth remembering that there are another 14 jurisdictions that have introduced gender recognition laws akin to what Scotland is doing. There hasn't been a massive crisis. They haven't raised issues that some of the opponents of this law have been concerned about. Now, there is a further debate here, I think, where some people reject the idea of the existence of trans people, or that they say that more or less the government shouldn't be giving any recognition. Unfortunately, that is not the status quo anywhere in the UK. It is possible, going through a medical process at the moment, to seek recognition. So there are people, obviously, who have other concerns about trans issues, but I don't think that necessarily changes whether or not we should be recognising them in this particular context.
Matthew and Kezia, thank you thus far for taking us through the papers and sharing your views. We're going to take a break. Coming up, warnings to think twice before visiting grandparents this Christmas. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Kezia Dugdale, the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, and Matthew Lesh, the head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome back to both of you. Right, let's have a look at the Times. And this is a warning to stay away from vulnerable grandparents if you've got a cough or cold over Christmas. Probably easier said than done for a lot of people. What do you make of this, Kezia?
I think a lot of people will see that headline and go, oh no, not again, we're being asked to make restrictions in order to protect the most vulnerable people in our lives. It's not COVID this time, though, it's the flu. And there's a suggestion in this article that flu is at the highest level it's been in 5 years, that it was very much at abeyance because of COVID, and it's coming back with a vengeance now. And as a consequence of that, we need to protect people who are most likely to suffer the extreme consequences of flu, and that's older people. Reminder also in this article, for anyone who hasn't had their free flu jab yet, that they should access it. If you're over 50, you can get that for free. And in fact, if you're under 50, you can get it from a lot of pharmacists. It's one thing you can do to stop the spread and also to protect those people you care about in your life this Christmas.
Yeah, it is difficult, Matthew, isn't it? Because our immunities are down, as we say, because of COVID, and we've been locked away and wearing masks, etc. But now we have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think flu, just like we've learned to live with COVID, we've been living with flu for many, many years. I mean, I'm personally been uncomfortable seeing the kind of logic of COVID extended out to other areas of public health advice. Now, of course, if you are actively sick, maybe it's not a good idea to go see an elderly and fragile older family member. But at the same time, life to some extent is all about risks and trade-offs, and whether or not you therefore don't see your family at all over Christmas seems like quite a miserable way to be spending the festive season. And at the same time, of course, I think re-emphasising the advice about ensure you do get a flu jab. My partner just recently got the flu, and I was very much lauding it over him that I was symptom-free as a result of my early flu jab in September. So they do seem to work, and I can say go and get them, because even if you are a bit younger, the flu can still be a bit miserable.
No, it can be very, very miserable. Maybe we sort of go back, or it becomes part of our normal day-to-day routine to wear masks. Maybe that will help. I'll just throw that in there, but we don't need to discuss it right now. Let's have a look at this last story. And according to The Express, we are going to have a Merry Christmas if it kills us. We're going to go out and spend our hard-earned money, Kezia.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is so much a story as a plea for help from the retail sector that, of course, had a really difficult year. And it's a call to action, really, with 48 hours to go until at least the shop shut and Christmas begins in the truest sense. An appeal that we all go out and spend our money to cheer ourselves up, whether that be on food for Christmas meals or buying presents in the shops for the people that we care about and we're going to spend the weekend with. Real hope here that there's going to be a rush at the retail kind of exchequer and a boost to the economy in the dying days of 2022.
Yeah, I like the way the article says a last-minute spending spree will give high streets a much-needed £2.6 billion boost, as if they know exactly how much we're going to go out and spend, Matthew.
Yeah, it's very optimistic and forward-looking and positive. And look, there's no doubt a lot of truth to it, that there is there's a cyclical spending pattern. We know that every year around this time, people do spend a lot more money. They buy a lot more groceries for Christmas-related events, as well as things for people they do love and presents. Of course, it's not for everyone. There's a lot of people this time of year who struggle to provide the kind of Christmas they want for their family, and that should be kept in the back of mind. But for those who do have it, live life to the fullest, spend to fulfill your needs and wants.
Yes, consumer expert Scott Dixon quoted saying cash-strapped consumers are determined to enjoy this Christmas despite the ongoing chaos with strikes and the cost of living crisis after previous years of COVID restrictions. So, yeah, go out and spend if you can afford to. Kezia and Matthew, thank you so much for taking us through the papers. We'll see you in the next hour.